Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about how the New York Times says Trump made a mistake, and that America needs to get ready for China's next 2.0 shock. According to American scholars, U.S. policy changes all the time, and American politicians' attention spans are as short as mice on cocaine, extremely brief. Trump has completely reversed the Biden administration's policies and turned inward, causing American elites to wail in despair. The New York Times published an article by MIT economics professor David Autor and Harvard Kennedy School economics professor Gordon Hanson. Both of them are renowned scholars who study globalization, especially the rise of China, with a main focus on how globalization has reshaped the American labor market. In their article, they state, China's first disruption of the U.S. economy occurred between 1999 and 2007, causing nearly a quarter of American manufacturing jobs to disappear. This China shock was driven by a unique process. In the late 1970s, China transitioned from a planned economy to a market economy. This transformation happened rapidly, shifting China's labor and capital from collective farms to capitalist urban factories. The wave of cheap Chinese goods destroyed the economic foundation of regions in the U.S. that relied on manufacturing. For example, Martinsville in Virginia and High Point in North Carolina. These two places were once the world capitals of athletic shoes and furniture. 20 years later, workers in these areas still haven't recovered from unemployment. Although these places are growing again, most of the new jobs are concentrated in low-wage industries. Similar stories have played out across dozens of labor-intensive industries. The same thing happened in textiles, toys, sporting goods, electronics, plastics, and auto parts. However, after China completed its transition to manufacturing, around 2015, this shock came to an end. After that, employment in U.S. manufacturing began to rebound. There was growth during President Obama's administration, Trump's first term, and President Biden's term, across the last three presidencies. These two scholars say, you might ask, so why am I still talking about the China shock now? He says he really wishes he didn't have to, but U.S. policymakers have spent too much time looking back. They're fighting the last war, when they should be spending more time examining the new wave of China shock that's emerging. They believe that China Shock 1.0 was just a flash in the pan. Essentially, China did what it should have done decades ago, which ended up causing unnecessary and painful unemployment in the U.S. But the direction of U.S. policy today is misguided. Americans are never going to sell their own sneakers on Tmall, nor are they going to assemble AirPods. It is estimated that China's manufacturing workforce far exceeds 100 million people, while the U.S. has only 13 million manufacturing workers. To think that the U.S. can or even should compete with China in manufacturing semiconductors and sneakers is almost delusional. A rapidly approaching China Shock 2.0 means that China is shifting from a position of weakness to one of strength. Today, China is actively vying for leadership in innovative fields that the United States has long dominated without question, including aviation, artificial intelligence, telecommunications, microprocessors, robotics, nuclear energy, nuclear fusion, quantum computing, biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, solar cells, and more. Let's not forget that these fields can bring significant rewards, including economic benefits from high profits and high-paying jobs. At the same time, the frontiers of digital technology also bring geopolitical influence and military power to control the battlefield. General Motors, Boeing, and Intel are all American national champion companies, and they have all experienced their glory days. If they were to disappear, Americans would really miss them. China's technological vision has already reshaped governments and markets in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. As the United States now retreats into the so-called Great Circle of isolationism, it can be expected that China's influence will further increase. In the early 1990s and the 21st century, Chinese private enterprises and multinational corporations worked together to turn China into the world's factory. But now, the new Chinese model is somewhat different. Private enterprises are now working hand in hand with the Chinese government, and China has created an innovation ecosystem that, while costly, is flexible. Local officials such as mayors and provincial governors are now rewarded for growth in certain advanced sectors. Previously, their performance was assessed solely based on total GDP, which is a rather rigid metric. Now, their evaluation criteria have been optimized. Before Hefei became China's third-largest electric vehicle production base, it was just the little-known capital of Anhui, a poor inland province. Now, by bringing in venture capital, taking on the risks faced by Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, and investing in local R&D, Hefei has, in just 5 years, leapt to become one of China's top industrial cities. China has created such miracles many times before. The country's largest and most innovative electric vehicle company, BYD, the EV battery manufacturer CATL, the drone maker DJI, and the solar wafer producer LONGi, all of them are Chinese startups founded less than 30 years ago. The reason they have achieved technological and price leadership is because they emerged as winners under the framework of China's industrial policy, a kind of economic Darwinism. Other countries around the world are not yet prepared to compete with these top predators from China. When American policymakers mock China's industrial policy, what they actually have in mind is something like Europe's Airbus, a big, clumsy company, or the American green energy company Solyndra, which went bankrupt. These decision-makers should look up at the agile swarms of military drones circling over Ukraine to truly understand what China's new industries are all about. When China's supply of low-cost labor is exhausted, China's Shock 1.0 is bound to fade away. That's already the case now. In industries like apparel and commodity furniture, China's growth rate has already fallen behind Vietnam. But unlike the United States, China hasn't looked back to mourn the loss of these labor-intensive industries. On the contrary, China is now focusing on the key technologies of the 21st century and, with a strategy built on more than just cheap labor, China's Shock 2.0 will continue. As long as China has the resources, patience, and discipline to compete fiercely. If you doubt China's capability or determination, the evidence isn't on your side. According to data from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a think tank funded by the Australian Department of Defence, between 2003 and 2007, out of 64 cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence and cryptography, the United States led China in 60 of them, while China was ahead of the US in only 3. 16 years later, in the latest report covering 2019 to 2023, the rankings have reversed. Out of 64 key technologies, China now leads in 57, while the United States leads in only 7. So how are American policymakers responding now? Mainly by imposing tariffs, levying tariffs on all countries at once. This was originally a rather dull strategy to deal with the fact that the US lost the trade war 20 years ago. According to the current trajectory of the United States, it might end up getting the jobs that make tennis shoes. If the US develops further, by 2030, it might even be able to assemble iPhones in Texas. These jobs are both tedious and low-paying. This situation is so ironic that The Onion once joked that Chinese factory workers were worried they might never be replaced by machines, meaning, they were actually being replaced by American workers. But the methods proposed by these scholars for the US to respond are exactly the opposite of what Trump is doing now. For example, they suggest joining forces with allies to encircle China, encouraging China to build car battery factories and the like in the US, and having America invest on its own in strategically important sectors. But they lament that the attention span of the American political system is as fleeting as a bug on cocaine. It constantly changes incentives and policies. They say that whether or not you agree that Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is worthwhile, the way the US has just started investing in climate technology and is already planning to cut funding after only 3 years is definitely a very bad idea. Similarly, for example, Trump calling on Congress to so hastily fire those talented chip and science teams does nothing to help strengthen America's leadership in AI chips. These two scholars are deeply distressed by the current state of the US. Their conclusion is that the risks facing America are enormous. Yet, right now, American politicians are still looking in the rearview mirror, but have lost their sense of direction. In addition, China is taking advantage of America's mistakes by continuing to do the right things, including vigorously promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. According to information cited by the Jinyinxi News from Griffith University in Australia and the Beijing Institute of Green Finance and Sustainable Development, China is rapidly expanding its international investment and construction activities, increasing its presence in countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. This approach is completely different from how the United States develops economic and trade relations with other regions of the world. According to their research, in the first 6 months of this year, China signed construction and investment contracts worth a total of $124 billion with countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, involving 176 deals. A figure for just half a year has already surpassed the total of $122.1 billion for the entire previous year. Wang Aoli, one of the authors of the study, said that China's level of participation this year has surged, which is surprising. What makes this year different is the scale. Several major deals each exceeded $10 billion. Wang Aoli also said that the trade war triggered by Trump's tariffs, the slowdown in China's domestic economic growth, and the need for supply chain and market diversification have prompted some Chinese companies to look overseas. Meanwhile, Belt and Road countries see an opportunity to deepen their ties with China against the backdrop of changes in the global geoeconomic landscape. To put it bluntly, Trump reversed Biden's policy of rallying allies to encircle China by indiscriminately imposing tariffs on all countries, which has made many nations more willing to cooperate with China, investing in infrastructure and developing energy to drive their own economic growth. This study points out that this year, China's involvement in the energy sector has reached its highest level since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. It also notes that the region with the highest value of such investments and construction contracts is Africa, at $3.9 billion, followed by Central Asia, at $2.5 billion. However, if we look at individual countries, Kazakhstan in Central Asia is the top recipient of Chinese investment among Belt and Road partners, with investments there alone reaching $2.3 billion. Meanwhile, the value of contract investments in Latin America has hit a new low in the past decade. To sum it up this way: first, everyone sees the risks of Trump coming to power, but they don't see the opportunities he might bring for China. Second, when it comes to U.S. domestic affairs, as the New York Times quoted two American scholars, the attention span of the U.S. political system is like a bug on cocaine, extremely short. Policies change frequently. Trump often ends up looking in the rearview mirror and loses his sense of direction. Third, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, Trump imposed global tariffs indiscriminately and drove away his friends. Meanwhile, in the first half of the year, China doubled its investments in various sectors through the Belt and Road Initiative and benefited as a result.